Empire of Blood. Episode 10. The Architect of Extinction, Adolf Hitler, Nazi Germany, 1933 to 1945. The smell reaches the platform before the doors open. That is the first thing survivors remember. Not the dogs, though there are dogs. Massive German shepherds straining at their leashes along the ramp. Not the lights, though the floodlights cut the Polish night into hard geometry, turning the gravel platform bright white and the darkness beyond it absolute. Not even the shouted commands in German, though those are constant, relentless, a wall of harsh sound pressing the ears. No. The smell is first. It reaches through the wooden slats of the cattle car before anyone inside can see what is waiting for them outside. Ammonia. Rot. The biological evidence of what happens when 90 human beings are sealed into a freight car built for cattle and left there for 3 days without water, without toilets, without any provision for survival except the collective body heat that keeps them from freezing in the Polish spring. Then the doors open. The train from Hungary arrived at Auschwitz-Birkenau on May 20th, 1944. It had left the city of Debrecen 4 days earlier. The passengers, that is the word used in the German railway documents, passengers, had been told different things by different officials before boarding. Some had been told they were being resettled in the east. Some had been told nothing at all, simply rounded up at the train station, pushed onto the platform, and loaded into cars whose doors were then sealed from the outside with metal bolts. Some had managed to hide small amounts of food. Most had not. All of them were thirsty beyond anything they had previously experienced. The ramp at Birkenau in May 1944 is not chaos. That is the first thing you have to understand about it. It looks like chaos. It sounds like chaos. The noise is tremendous. Crying, shouting, the bark of commands, the sounds of families collapsing against each other and then being pulled apart. But every movement on that ramp has been rehearsed. Every position of every guard has been calculated. The funnel of bodies moving from the cars to the sorting point has been refined over 3 years of earlier arrivals. The men in the grey-green uniforms know exactly what they are doing. The selection takes approximately 30 minutes. An SS physician walks the line. On many evenings it is Josef Mengele, SS Hauptsturmführer Josef Mengele, 32 years old, a man with a doctorate in anthropology and a medical degree. A man who had received honors for valor on the Eastern Front and had specifically requested the assignment to Auschwitz. On other evenings, it is one of the other medical officers assigned to the ramp. The physician walks the line and he looks at bodies. He's looking for the capacity for labor. He is making assessments with the speed of long practice. This one is strong enough. This one is not. This child is certainly not. This grandmother certainly not. This pregnant woman, no. This young man, yes. This young woman, perhaps. To the right means the camp. To the left means something else. The elderly go left. Children go left. Mothers who cannot release their children's hands, who choose, in that moment, holding their child's hand over an uncertain right, go left. Of the roughly 437,000 Hungarian Jews who will be transported to Birkenau between May and July of 1944, approximately 320,000 will be sent directly from the ramp to the gas chambers. They are told they are going to shower. This is the detail that should stop you entirely if you allow yourself to think about it. They are told they are going to shower. They are handed soap. Sometimes the soap is real. Sometimes it is a prop, a painted wooden block. The guards have found, through experience, that the pretense of normalcy reduces panic, and panic creates complications. The undressing rooms below the gas chambers have numbered hooks on the walls. The prisoners are told to remember their numbers so they can retrieve their belongings afterward. Orderly, methodical, courteous in its way. The false promise of after. Some of them believe it. Some of them know. Some of them suspect and choose to hope because hope is the last thing the human body surrenders. Human beings will accept a lie if the truth is too large to hold, and the truth in that moment, that the door they are walking through is the last door, is among the largest truths that has ever existed. The gas chambers at Birkenau can hold 2,000 people. The Zyklon B pellets are dropped through holes in the roof into a sealed room full of people who are naked and frightened, and some of whom are praying, and some of whom are telling their children it will be all right, and some of whom already know it will not. It takes between 15 and 20 minutes. The Sonderkommando, Jewish prisoners forced to carry out this work, spared their own deaths temporarily in exchange for removing the dead and operating the crematoria, open the doors afterward with their faces wrapped in rags against the smell. They cut hair, they extract gold teeth, they carry the bodies, they drag them to the crematoria and load them into the furnaces. The entire process from train arrival to ash takes less than 4 hours. By the summer of 1944, Birkenau is killing up to 10,000 people per day. 10,000. Hold that number. Refuse to let it become abstract. 10,000 people per day means that in the time it takes to listen to this episode, roughly 2 hours, approximately 830 people would have been murdered. At this one location, in this one camp, in this one summer of its operation, Auschwitz-Birkenau operated as a killing center from 1942 to January 1945. In 3 years, it killed between 1.1 and 1.5 million people. Now ask the question that this show always asks. Who decided this? Not who built it. Though we will get there. Not who ran it. Though we will get there too. Who decided that this was the solution? Who sat in a room at some point, or many rooms over many years, and concluded that the Jewish people of Europe needed to be exterminated? Every last one of them. Systematically, industrially, with railway schedules and construction contracts and quarterly reports. Who did that? And then, who built the machine that translated that decision into 10,000 people per day? His name was Adolf Hitler. He was not a demon. This is the first thing to say, and perhaps the hardest. He was not a supernatural force, not an aberration inserted into history by some external agency of evil. He was born in a particular place, raised in a particular household, educated by the particular circumstances of his particular time. He made choices, thousands of choices, across decades, each one building on the last, each one moving him further along a path that led, with a logical consistency that is nauseating in retrospect, to that ramp at Birkenau. He was a human being who found in hatred a sense of purpose, who found in power a means of expression, who found in the mechanisms of a modern industrial state the tools to transform his inner world into policy. The most terrifying thing about Adolf Hitler is not that he was monstrous, it is that he was possible. Stay with me. To understand how Germany became what it became, you have to start in a hotel ballroom in Versailles, France, on June 28, 1919. The war has been over for 8 months. The armistice was signed in November 1918 in a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne by German civilian politicians who had inherited the wreckage of a conflict they had not started, or at least not started alone, and who had no leverage whatsoever in the peace negotiations that followed. The German delegation has been waiting at Versailles for months. They have not been consulted. They have submitted written objections to specific terms, and those objections have been almost entirely dismissed. They are now being presented with a document and told to sign it. The document runs to 440 articles. Germany loses Alsace-Lorraine to France. It loses Eupen and Malmedy to Belgium. It loses North Schleswig to Denmark, following a plebiscite. It loses the Rhineland, not in territory, but in military access. The region is to be demilitarized and occupied by Allied troops. It loses the Polish corridor, a strip of land cutting through German territory, to give the new state of Poland access to the sea, leaving the city of Danzig isolated as a nominally independent free city. It loses all of its overseas colonies. Its military is reduced to 100,000 men and stripped of heavy artillery, tanks, submarines, and any air force whatsoever. And then there is Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. Germany accepts full and sole responsibility for causing the war and all the losses suffered by Allied nations as a result. On this basis, Germany is required to pay reparations, ultimately calculated at 132 billion gold marks. A figure so large as to be essentially impossible to pay, and widely understood at the time to be as much about humiliation as compensation. The German politicians who signed this document were not fools. They were realists in an impossible position. They signed because the alternative was the resumption of war, and Germany could not fight anymore. Some of them were right in assuming that over time the terms might be renegotiated, and indeed some terms were later modified. But they were catastrophically wrong about the political consequences of that signature. Because from the moment the ink dried, the German nationalist right had its story. The story was precise. It was emotionally resonant, and it was a lie constructed with enough proximity to truth that it could not easily be dislodged. The story said Germany was never truly defeated. The German army was fighting brilliantly when it was betrayed from within. By cowards, by socialists, by Jews, by the so-called November criminals, the politicians who signed the armistice, who surrendered when victory was within reach, who stabbed the heroic German army in the back. The Dolchstoßlegende, the stab-in-the-back myth. It was not true. Germany had been losing the war in the field for months before the armistice. The supreme command of the German army, Hindenburg and Ludendorff, had themselves recommended requesting an armistice, and had then quietly stepped back and allowed the civilian politicians to carry out the actual signing, leaving those civilians to absorb the political consequences of a military decision. The generals invented the stab-in-the-back story, partly to protect their own reputations and partly because the alternative, admitting that Germany had simply been outmatched, was unbearable to men whose professional identity was built entirely on military superiority. But in politics, a useful story does not require truth. It requires emotional plausibility and a target for rage. The stab-in-the-back myth had both, and it would fuel the nationalist right for the next 14 years. Into this poisoned landscape, the Weimar Republic was born. The Republic is one of history's great experiments in democracy under impossible conditions, and one of its most instructive disasters. It was declared in November 1918, in the final days of the war, by politicians who had inherited not a functioning state, but a catastrophe. They were fighting off a communist revolution on the left. The Spartacists, who wanted to replicate the Bolshevik Revolution, using right-wing paramilitary units called the Freikorps, whose violence and nationalist politics would later flow directly into the Nazi movement. On the right, the conservative elites who had run Imperial Germany, the industrialists, the Junker landowners, the military officer corps, viewed the Republic with contempt and waited for the opportunity to return to power. And then came the hyperinflation. Between 1921 and 1923, the German currency lost its value with a speed and completeness that remains almost incomprehensible from the outside. In January 1921, $1 bought roughly 90 German marks. By November 1923, $1 bought 4.2 trillion German marks. 4.2 trillion. The numbers defeat ordinary arithmetic. People carried cash to buy bread in wheelbarrows, not as a figure of speech, but because a wheelbarrow's worth of banknotes was the physical volume of currency required to purchase a single loaf. A restaurant would charge you one price at the beginning of a meal and a higher price by the end of it, because the value of the currency was declining by the hour. Workers demanded to be paid twice daily so they could spend the first half before it lost more value. Think about what that does to a society. You worked your entire life. You saved. You were careful, responsible, prudent. You did everything that a respectable German middle-class household was supposed to do. And then you watched your savings become literally, measurably worthless. Not metaphorically worthless, not devalued, worth nothing. The teacher, the engineer, the small businessman, the widow living on her late husband's pension, all of them devastated. The social contract seemed to have been revealed as fraudulent. And when the social contract collapses, people do not become philosophical about it. They become furious. They demand to know who is responsible. They want a target. The hyperinflation crisis was eventually resolved through currency reform and foreign loans. The Dawes Plan, largely funded by American banks, which stabilized the German economy by the mid-1920s. The Weimar Republic's middle years, roughly 1924 to 1929, were actually a period of genuine prosperity. German art and culture flourished. The jazz clubs of Berlin, the Bauhaus School, the expressionist cinema, Weimar Germany was in many ways the most culturally alive place in Europe. The Nazi Party's electoral share in 1928 was 2.6%. The fevered politics of the early 1920s seemed to be receding. And then October 24th, 1929. Black Thursday. The American stock market crashed. The Great Depression hit Germany with the force of a sledgehammer, because the German economic recovery of the 1920s had been built on a foundation of short-term American loans, and when those loans were called in, the foundation gave way. Banks collapsed, credit dried up, factories closed, unemployment exploded. From around 1.3 million in 1929 to over 6 million by 1932. That is roughly 30% of the German labor force standing in lines at employment offices, and these are only the registered unemployed. The actual number of people without adequate work or income was considerably higher. In the industrial cities, Hamburg, Berlin, the Ruhr Valley, the soup kitchens stretched for blocks. Men who had been factory foremen and bank clerks stood in those lines alongside laborers and dock workers. The humiliation was compounding. You had survived the war. You had survived the hyperinflation. And now this. The political implications were swift and severe. The moderate, centrist parties that had built the Weimar Republic found themselves unable to respond. The coalition arithmetic of parliamentary democracy, which requires compromise, which requires patience, which requires trust that the system can eventually solve the problem, broke down under the pressure of emergency. The Reichstag fractured into parties that could not form workable governing majorities. Between 1930 and 1933, Germany had 3 chancellors in 3 years, each governing through emergency decrees authorized under Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution, bypassing Parliament because Parliament could not function. The democratic center was visibly failing. The extremes grew. The Communist Party of Germany, the KPD, attracted workers who saw in Moscow's example proof that capitalism could be destroyed and replaced. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, the NSDAP, attracted everyone else who wanted the system destroyed. The humiliated middle class, the unemployed veterans, the young men who had grown up in the shadow of defeat and now saw their futures collapsing before they had properly begun. In the July 1932 federal elections, the Nazis won 37.4% of the vote, the largest share of any single party. The Communists won 14.6%. Between them, two parties explicitly committed to destroying the Weimar Republic had the support of more than half the electorate. At this point, Germany's conservative elites made a calculation. It was the wrong one. The men around President Paul von Hindenburg, the aging field marshal who had become a kind of symbolic anchor of the old Germany, elected president in 1925 at the age of 77, were sophisticated people. They were not fools. They understood that Hitler was dangerous. What they believed was that he was controllable. They believed the Nazis could be brought into a coalition government as junior partners, given the appearance of power while actual authority remained with experienced, responsible conservatives. Franz von Papen, who briefly served as Chancellor in 1932 and who was instrumental in the back-channel negotiations that brought Hitler to power, reportedly told a colleague that within 2 months they would have pushed Hitler so far into a corner that he would squeak. On January 30th, 1933, President Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. Within 3 months, constitutional democracy in Germany was functionally dead. The Reichstag fire provided the pretext. On the night of February 27, 1933, the Reichstag building went up in flames. A Dutch communist named Marinus van der Lubbe was arrested at the scene. Hitler immediately used the fire to declare a national emergency, suspending civil liberties under Article 48, the same constitutional provision that had been used for emergency governance, and ordering mass arrests of communist officials. Whether the Nazis set the fire themselves, or whether van der Lubbe acted alone as the evidence partially suggests, is a historical question that remains contested. What is not contested is that the fire was used to launch a wave of political repression that had clearly been prepared in advance. The arrests began within hours. The emergency decree that suspended civil liberties was in place within 24 hours. The logic of the response was too swift, too organized, too comprehensive to have been improvised. The Enabling Act followed on March 23, 1933. It gave the cabinet the power to enact laws without parliamentary approval for 4 years, effectively suspending constitutional government at a single vote. The Social Democrats voted against it. The Communists had been arrested or were in hiding. The Catholic Centre Party and the Conservative Nationalist parties voted for it, persuaded or intimidated into compliance. The Enabling Act passed. Then the political parties were dissolved or banned, all except the NSDAP. Then the trade unions were seized. Then the press was brought under state control. Then the civil service was purged. Then the judiciary was restructured to ensure compliance. Then the German states lost their autonomy to the central government. Then Hindenburg died in August 1934, and Hitler merged the offices of Chancellor and President into a new title, Führer and Reich Chancellor, and had the German military swear a personal oath of loyalty, not to Germany, not to its constitution, but to Adolf Hitler, by name, personally. The oath. Think about what that oath meant for the institution of the German military. The military in most modern states, swears loyalty to the Constitution, to the nation, to an abstraction that is larger than any individual. The personal oath to Hitler transformed the German military into something that in principle could not resist him without violating the most fundamental obligation of a soldier. This was deliberate. This was thought through, and it would matter enormously when the time came, as it came repeatedly, for senior officers to resist and find themselves unable to frame that resistance in terms their own conscience could accept. The conservative elites had their mailbox. What they had actually installed was a furnace, and the ideological infrastructure was already being assembled. The Nazi state was not a simple tyranny of one man commanding an obedient machine. It was something more complex and in some ways more terrifying. A system of competitive fanaticism in which multiple power centers and institutions competed with each other to demonstrate ideological purity and operational effectiveness in carrying out the regime's goals. The SS competed with the Wehrmacht. The Gestapo competed with the SD. Regional Nazi officials, the Gauleiters, competed with central government ministries. The result was an organizational structure that was often chaotic and inefficient in its day-to-day administration, but that was relentlessly radical in its overall direction, because the competition always pushed toward greater extremism. And at the center of it all, providing the ideological gravity that held the entire system in orbit, was the man himself. To understand what Germany became, you have to understand what it had already agreed to become by the time Hitler took power. The ideology was not new. It did not arrive with him. The components, aggressive German nationalism, biological racism, anti-Semitism, the myth of Aryan racial superiority, had been circulating in German and European intellectual culture for decades. The specific form of Nazi ideology represented a synthesis and radicalization of ideas that were already present in the cultural ecosystem. Hitler did not invent German anti-Semitism. He weaponized it. But the weaponization required a man who believed in it absolutely, who was willing to follow its logic to wherever it led, and who had the political and organizational genius, and genius is the right word, however uncomfortable it is to apply it here, to build the machine that could act on it at scale. That machine was modern Germany. And the man who built it was about to reveal what he had always intended to do with it. He was born on the 20th of April, 1889, in a small Austrian town called Braunau am Inn, on the border between Austria and Bavaria. The town had a population of roughly 6,000. The Salzach River ran a few hundred meters from his birthplace. The house was an inn, rented by his family on the second floor. Respectable, but not comfortable. Middle class in aspiration, but not quite in reality. His father was Alois Hitler. Alois is a figure worth examining for more than a moment, because he is, more than many biographers have allowed, a genuine psychological origin point for his son. Alois was the illegitimate son of Maria Schicklgruber, a domestic servant, and a father whose identity was uncertain enough that he went by his mother's name for the first 39 years of his life, before taking the surname Hitler upon his stepfather's formal acknowledgement. He was, in other words, a man who had spent nearly 4 decades as a man of uncertain origin, a fact that carries a particular weight in a culture that placed enormous emphasis on lineage, identity, and bloodline. Alois had worked his way up from rural poverty to a position as a customs official, a minor government bureaucrat essentially, but one with a uniform and a title and local authority. He had earned this through his own effort and intelligence, and he wore it like a man who had never quite stopped being surprised to have it, and who could not entirely forgive the world for making it so difficult to obtain. He was strict in the way of men who have been granted a small amount of power and are terrified of losing it. He was vain, he drank heavily, he kept bees as a hobby and apparently managed them with more patience than he managed his family. He beat his wife and children with the routine indifference of a man who understood this as a normal element of domestic authority. The historical record on the severity of this is contested. His son's accounts are the primary source, and those accounts are not always reliable. But what is consistent across multiple accounts is that the household was a place where fear was a standard atmospheric condition. Clara, his third wife, was 23 years younger than Alois and had grown up in his household as his ward. A relationship that was uncomfortably close even by the standards of the day and required a special dispensation to legalize. She was a gentle woman by most accounts, deeply devoted to her children. She had lost 3 of them to illness, diphtheria and measles, the casual murderers of the late 19th century, before Adolf was born. The grief of those losses seems to have transferred into a protectiveness so intense it might more accurately be called anxiety. Adolf was her surviving son. She organized her emotional world around him. This combination, the cold, authoritarian, contemptuous father and the warm, anxious, emotionally over-reliant mother, is not a formula that produces balanced people. It tends to produce people with a grandiose self-image armored against the world, with a deep need for external validation, with a sensitivity to perceived insult or rejection that goes far beyond what normal experience would warrant, and with a fundamental inability to accept failure as information rather than persecution. Watch for these qualities. You will see them repeatedly. Alois died in January 1903 when Adolf was 13. The official family record describes a quick death at a local tavern. Alois set down his wineglass and collapsed. Adolf reportedly behaved well at the funeral. He showed little visible grief. What changed in the month that followed was more informative than any emotional display would have been. He stopped applying himself at school. His grades, which had been adequate, deteriorated. He refused to accept discipline from teachers. He began to nurse a quiet, persistent conviction that the ordinary rules of academic performance did not really apply to him, that he was destined for something beyond the measurable criteria by which ordinary students were evaluated. He wanted to be a painter. This ambition tends to get reduced to biographical shorthand, the almost artist who became a monster, when it is actually one of the most important things to understand about him. The artistic ambition was not incidental. It was a window into his self-conception. He saw himself as a creative genius, a person of exceptional sensitivity and vision, whose inner world was richer and more significant than the ordinary people around him could access or appreciate. He sketched constantly. Architectural drawings, cityscapes, studies of buildings. The drawings themselves are competent in the way that suggests genuine diligence and a certain visual intelligence, but they are curiously lifeless. There are no people in them. Or when there are people, they are so small as to be decorative, elements of composition rather than subjects of attention. There are no people in them. In 1907, at 18, he traveled to Vienna and presented his portfolio to the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts with the absolute certainty of a young man who has never been seriously told that his gifts might be ordinary. The Academy's admissions committee reviewed his work and rejected him. He applied again in 1908. They rejected him again, this time more definitively, declining to allow him to sit the full entrance examination and noting that his submitted work showed insufficient talent. He did not respond the way a resilient person responds to failure. He did not take the rejection as information and recalibrate. He did not work harder, study longer, seek mentorship, consider whether another direction might suit him better. He constructed a narrative in which the rejection was someone else's fault. The professors, he decided, did not recognize genius when it was presented to them. They were Jews, or they were under Jewish influence, or there was some other external corruption that explained why his obvious superiority had not been acknowledged. The failure could not be his. The inner sense of specialness would not permit that interpretation. This is the pattern. Remember it, because it is the psychological engine of everything that follows. Every setback that Adolf Hitler experienced for the rest of his life, every political defeat, every military reversal, every failure of his plans, would be attributed to external forces, external enemies, external betrayal, never to error in his own judgment, never to limitations in his own ability. The self-image was impermeable to disconfirming evidence, because if it ever cracked, the entire psychic structure built on it would collapse. He stayed in Vienna, living first on the small inheritance his mother had left him. She died of breast cancer in December 1907, just months after his first academy rejection, receiving morphine injections from her Jewish doctor, Eduard Bloch, for whom Hitler apparently retained a lifelong exceptional gratitude, and later on an orphan's pension and the occasional sale of watercolor postcards of Viennese landmarks. He sketched the Karlskirche, the Parliament building, the Opera House. A small-time art dealer sold them to tourists and to frame shops. He was not quite homeless, but he was not far from it during certain periods. He spent time at the Männerheim, a men's dormitory in the 20th district, a respectable refuge for the urban poor, with a reading room and a cafeteria, but also a place that crystallized what it felt like to be a young man of enormous self-regard, existing on the absolute margin of the social order. He read constantly, not books particularly, not systematically, pamphlets, political tracts, nationalist newspapers, anti-Semitic literature. And Vienna in 1908 was a city absolutely saturated with this material. Vienna had a Jewish population of roughly 9%, the largest Jewish community in the German-speaking world. It also had a mayor, Karl Lueger, who had been elected on an explicitly anti-Semitic platform and who was popular enough to have been re-elected multiple times. The newspaper racks in the Männerheim reading room included publications like Ostara, a periodical published by a defrocked monk named Jörg Lanz von Liebenfels, which propagated a bizarre pseudo-scientific mythology of Aryan racial superiority and Jewish racial contamination, illustrated with grotesque imagery of racial mixing and degradation. This was not fringe material. It was in the cultural mainstream of Viennese political discourse. Hitler absorbed it all. The precise moment at which anti-Semitic prejudice, which was widespread and culturally normalized in the world he inhabited, a kind of background radiation of European political culture, became for Hitler the burning, total, organizing obsession of his entire existence is impossible to pinpoint with certainty. He himself describes a gradual conversion in Mein Kampf, presenting it as a rational awakening, an empirical discovery of what he calls the truth about the Jewish people. Historians have debated how much of this account represents his actual psychological development and how much is retrospective myth-making. The evidence suggests that the transformation was real, but more emotionally than intellectually driven. That Hitler did not reason his way to anti-Semitism, but was drawn to it because it satisfied psychological needs that went far deeper than ideology. Anti-Semitism gave him an explanation for his failure. It gave him a target for his rage. It gave him a sense of belonging to a noble cause, the defense of German civilization against a conspiratorial enemy. And it gave him a cosmology that made his own inadequacies irrelevant, because in this framework, personal failure was not the result of insufficient talent or effort, but of external sabotage by a malevolent enemy working against him and his kind. By the time he left Vienna in 1913, his worldview had its essential shape. The history of the world was racial conflict. Germans were a great race under existential threat. Jews were not a religious group or a cultural community, but a biological force. An anti-race whose purpose, conscious or unconscious, was the destruction of Aryan civilization. Germany's revival required, as its necessary precondition, the removal of Jewish influence from German life. He had not yet worked out what removal meant in practical terms. That would come later. He moved to Munich in May 1913, partly to escape Austrian military conscription. He had been avoiding the Austrian draft, and partly because Munich felt more genuinely German to him than the Habsburg cosmopolitan mixture of Vienna. The Bavarian capital suited his particular combination of German nationalist fervor and artistic aspiration. And then, in August 1914, the war began. He was photographed in the crowd at the Odeonsplatz in Munich on the day war was declared, his face open with an expression of pure, unadulterated joy that looks almost childlike in its sincerity. The camera captures something real here. He was genuinely, overwhelmingly thrilled. He later wrote that he dropped to his knees and thanked heaven for the gift of this moment, the opportunity to live through the great trial that would forge Germany anew. He was 25 years old. He volunteered the following day. He served with the 16th Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment as a Gefreiter, a private first class, primarily as a dispatch runner, carrying messages between the regimental headquarters and the front-line positions. This was dangerous work. The casualties among dispatch runners were significant. It required nerve, physical stamina, and a willingness to cross open ground under fire repeatedly. He was awarded the Iron Cross Second Class in 1914 and the Iron Cross First Class in 1918. The latter was unusual for his rank, and it was recommended by his regimental adjutant, Hugo Gutmann, who was Jewish. His later hagiographers omitted this detail carefully. His fellow soldiers remembered him with a mixture of respect for his physical courage and discomfort with his social oddness. He did not join in the informal camaraderie of the enlisted ranks. The jokes, the complaints about officers, the nostalgic talk of home and girls and peacetime pleasures. He was intense, earnest, perpetually lecturing to whoever would listen about politics and history and the German destiny. He held back from the ordinary human warmth of men in difficult circumstances, as though the warmth might compromise the seriousness of his purpose. He saw 4 years of the Western Front. He saw the particular, specific violence of trench warfare, the artillery barrages that turned fields into moonscapes and turned men into fragments, the poison gas attacks, the machine gun fire cutting down men in their hundreds before they had crossed 15 meters of no man's land. Whether this violence hardened him in new ways or simply confirmed beliefs he already held is not entirely clear. What is clear is that he survived it with his ideology more intense than ever, and with something else added to it, a personal familiarity with mass death, a direct experience of the fragility of human life on the scale of armies, that would inform his later decisions in ways that are uncomfortable to contemplate. In October 1918, near Ypres, he was temporarily blinded by a British gas attack and was evacuated to a military hospital at Passewalk in Pomerania. He was there, eyes bandaged, when the news arrived that Germany had signed an armistice. He wept. He describes this scene in Mein Kampf, and there is no reason to doubt the sincerity of it. He wept not because the war was over, but because Germany had surrendered, because the great mission to which he had given his 20s had ended in what he experienced as abject shame. And in that hospital bed, in those hours, something crystallized, a resolve or a commitment, or perhaps the full conscious articulation of something that had been building for years. He would go into politics. He would reverse this defeat. He would restore Germany. He was 29 years old. He had no money, no connections, no formal education, no professional qualifications, no particular reason to believe that any of this was within his reach. What he had was certainty. And in politics, in populist politics, in the specific political environment that was about to engulf post-war Germany, certainty is a resource of extraordinary value. He returned to Munich in 1919. The Munich he returned to was a city on the edge of revolution. A Soviet republic had briefly been declared in Bavaria, inspired by the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia and by the general ferment of a defeated nation, and had been suppressed with great violence by Freikorps units. The right-wing paramilitary formations, composed largely of veterans who had come home from the war to find a civilian world they couldn't relate to, and had stayed in uniform and kept fighting. The political atmosphere was electric and dangerous and alive with the kind of radical energy that forms when an existing order has collapsed and nothing has yet clearly replaced it. Hitler was working for the army's intelligence department, monitoring extremist political groups for subversive tendencies, attending their meetings and filing reports. In September 1919, he was sent to observe a small nationalist organization calling itself the Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, the German Workers' Party. It had perhaps 50 members. Its meetings were held in beer halls. Its ideology was a mixture of German nationalism, anti-Semitism, and vague economic grievances against capitalism that were attributed, inevitably, to Jewish financial power. He went to observe. He joined instead, and within months he had begun the process of taking it over. His ability to speak in public was the first and most essential instrument of everything that followed, and it requires more description than it usually gets, because it was genuinely unusual, qualitatively different from ordinary political oratory in ways that matter for understanding how he built what he built. He was not a polished speaker in the conventional sense. He was not witty or precise or elegant. He began his speeches slowly, tentatively even, with the hesitance of a man building his confidence in real time. The audience, watching this, leaned in. They wanted him to succeed. He created, in those opening moments, a kind of sympathetic contract with the room. And then, as the speech progressed, something would change. The pace would build. The voice would strengthen and deepen. The gestures, carefully practiced in front of mirrors, refined through hundreds of performances, would begin to match the rhetoric. And then the rhetoric itself would begin to do what Hitler's rhetoric could do uniquely. It would give the audience permission to feel what they already felt, but had not quite been licensed to express. Rage. The rage of men who believed they were exceptional people who had been cheated. The rage of people who had been told their suffering had a cause, that their enemy was identifiable, that the conspiracy against them could be named and fought. And beneath the rage, something almost transcendent, the sense of belonging to something vast and righteous and historically necessary. The sense of being, at last, on the right side of history. Joseph Goebbels, who was initially skeptical of Hitler and became one of his most devoted inner circle members, described hearing him speak for the first time as a religious experience. He wrote in his diary that he had gone in a doubter and come out a convert. Not because the arguments were new, but because the emotional delivery was overwhelming, because the sincerity was unmistakable. Hitler was not performing his beliefs. Or rather, he was performing them, but the performance was indistinguishable from the real thing, because the beliefs were real, and the sense of mission was real, and the rage was real. This authenticity, or this total fusion of performance and reality, was the quality that made him uniquely dangerous. He was not a cynical manipulator deploying rhetoric for personal gain. He was a true believer who had discovered that his particular form of belief was electorally explosive. By 1921, he had renamed the organization the National Sozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, the NSDAP, and installed himself as its undisputed Führer. By 1923, he was ready to attempt what he believed history demanded: the Beer Hall Putsch, November 8th and 9th, 1923. The plan was as ambitious as it was poorly executed. Hitler and the SA, the Sturmabteilung, the Nazi paramilitary force led by Ernst Röhm, seized a beer hall in Munich where leading Bavarian government officials were meeting, held them at gunpoint, and announced the beginning of a national revolution. The plan assumed that the Bavarian government and then the national government would collapse in the face of a decisive show of force, as Mussolini's march on Rome had produced results in Italy the previous year. Instead, the Bavarian police and army maintained their loyalty to the existing government. The following morning, when Nazi marchers attempted to enter the city center, the police opened fire. 14 Nazi demonstrators and 4 police officers were killed. The march dispersed. Hitler fled. He was arrested 2 days later. He was tried for treason. The trial was a platform. He used it to deliver lengthy speeches about German destiny and Jewish betrayal that were reported extensively in the nationalist press. The sympathetic judge gave him the minimum sentence, 5 years. He served 9 months at Landsberg prison, in a comfortable cell with a garden view, receiving visitors daily, eating food sent by supporters, and dictating to his secretary, Rudolf Hess. The book he produced in those 9 months was Mein Kampf. It is a long, sprawling, self-absorbed book, and in significant portions it is nearly unreadable. The prose is tangled, the digressions are interminable, the self-aggrandizement is exhausting. But it is also one of the most important documents of the 20th century, and the reason is simple. It says, clearly and explicitly, precisely what Hitler intended to do. It says that the German people are locked in an existential racial struggle with an array of enemies, of whom the most dangerous and fundamental is the Jewish people. It says that the future of Germany requires Lebensraum, living space in the East, which means the conquest and colonization of Eastern Europe at the expense of the Slavic peoples who live there. It articulates a vision of German continental dominance built on the elimination of racial enemies. The book sold respectably, but was not taken seriously by the conservative establishment that would, a decade later, bring Hitler to power. They read it as the fever dreams of a fringe agitator. They saw the author as a useful instrument, a man who could mobilize mass resentment and then be managed by more sophisticated hands. This was the third and perhaps most catastrophic miscalculation in the story. After his release from prison, Hitler returned to a changed situation. The economic stabilization of the mid-1920s had reduced the appeal of radical politics. The NSDAP's electoral performance was poor. Hitler spent these years reconsidering strategy, rebuilding the party organization, and expanding the network of regional chapters across Germany. He concluded that a frontal assault on a power, the Beer Hall Putsch model, had been a mistake. The path to power ran through elections. And then the Depression arrived and handed him the conditions his movement required. Between 1929 and 1933, every element aligned. Economic catastrophe that destroyed the credibility of the existing political parties. Social panic that made people willing to consider radical alternatives. A fractured democratic system incapable of forming stable governing majorities. Conservative elites looking for a controlled demagogue to stabilize things. And Hitler, having spent the lean years building an organizational machine capable of national mobilization, with a message precisely calibrated to the desperation of the moment. When Hindenburg appointed him a chancellor on January 30th, 1933, it was the result of a years-long process of strategic patience combined with organizational excellence and the extraordinary luck of perfect timing. Hitler understood that luck was not enough. What followed January 30th was a demonstration of political ruthlessness and strategic clarity that his opponents consistently underestimated until it was too late. The Reichstag fire in February gave him the emergency decree to suspend civil liberties. The Enabling Act in March gave him legislative power without parliament. The Night of the Long Knives in June 1934 eliminated the SA leadership, including his old ally Ernst Röhm, when they became a political liability, demonstrating that personal loyalty was entirely conditional on usefulness. Hindenburg's death in August 1934 merged the presidency into his own office. The personal oath of the military to Hitler by name created an institution that was constitutionally incapable of resistance. He had not improvised this. He had built it brick by brick, understanding exactly what each piece was for. And then the racial laws. The Nuremberg Laws of September 1935 stripped German Jews of their citizenship, prohibited marriage and sexual relations between Jews and non-Jews, and defined Jewishness in biological terms. This was not the beginning of the persecution. Jews had been facing violence, economic discrimination, and organized state harassment since 1933. But the Nuremberg Laws gave the persecution a legal framework that made it official, systematic, and impossible to avoid. You were not Jewish because of your religion. You were Jewish because of your grandparents' biology. You could not convert your way out. You could not assimilate your way out. You were what your blood said you were. This is the Nazi ideology at its most nakedly expressed. Not a political program, a cosmology. And on the night of November 9th and 10th, 1938, the cosmology turned violent in a new way. Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. The ostensible trigger was the assassination of Ernst vom Rath, a German diplomat in Paris, by Herschel Grynszpan, a 17-year-old Jewish boy whose parents had been forcibly deported to Poland with approximately 12,000 other Polish-born Jews in a mass expulsion the previous week, dumped at the Polish border in autumn rain with nothing but what they could carry. Grynszpan walked into the German embassy in Paris and shot vom Rath twice. Vom Rath died 2 days later. Hitler was in Munich on the night of vom Rath's death, attending the annual commemoration of the beer hall putsch. Goebbels spoke with him briefly. What passed between them is not precisely documented, but what followed is. Across Germany and Austria, SA men and Nazi activists, coordinated by Goebbels from Munich, began attacking Jewish properties. Synagogues were set on fire. More than 1,400 were burned or destroyed. Jewish-owned shops had their windows smashed. The broken glass that gave the night its name lay in glittering drifts across the streets of German cities by morning. 91 Jews were killed directly during the pogrom. 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps, not as punishment for any specific act, but simply because they were Jewish men, and sending them to camps demonstrated the power of the state over their lives. And the German public watched. This is the detail that matters. Most did not participate. Most were not enthusiastic perpetrators, but most watched. Most remained indoors while their neighbors' businesses burned. Most swept the broken glass from the sidewalk in front of their homes the following morning and went to work. Most looked at what had happened and made a calculation. Not a spoken calculation, not a conscious formal decision, but the soft, pervasive calculation of people who recognize that the cost of involvement is high and the path of least resistance is to look elsewhere. Hitler had understood this about Germany. Perhaps he had always understood it. From his years in Vienna, from his years in the Mannerheim reading room, absorbing the fact that anti-Semitic politics were not extreme in his world, but mainstream. He understood that most people, most of the time, will accommodate themselves to whatever their authority structure defines as normal, especially when that authority structure provides a compelling story that explains why the accommodation is not only acceptable, but required. He had been telling them that story for 15 years. Now he had the power. And the war was coming. Poland fell in September 1939. France fell in June 1940. By the summer of 1941, Germany controlled most of continental Europe, from the Atlantic coast to the outskirts of Moscow. The scale of territory, the scale of population under German control, and the specific ideological ambitions that Hitler had carried since his Vienna years now created the conditions for the decision that had been building since Mein Kampf. The Jews of Europe, all of them, everywhere in Nazi-controlled territory, were now within reach. In the summer of 1941, as the German army drove deep into the Soviet Union, the decision was made. The decision that set 10,000 people per day in motion. There is a house on the shore of the Wannsee Lake in suburban Berlin. It sits back from the water behind a long lawn, and in the summer the light on the lake is genuinely beautiful. Still and pale and silver in the morning, gold in the afternoon. The house is large, comfortable, bourgeois in the way of prosperous Germans in the 1930s. Solid wood furniture, high ceilings, good proportions. It looks like the kind of house where a family might spend a pleasant Sunday afternoon. There is a photograph of the dining room taken around the time of the meeting, and it looks like any formal dining room in any wealthy home. Chairs around a table, paintings on the wall. On January 20th, 1942, 15 men gathered in that dining room. The meeting lasted approximately 90 minutes. Afterward, they had lunch. The Wannsee Conference had been called by Reinhard Heydrich, chief of the Reich Security Main Office, at the request of Hermann Göring, to coordinate the implementation of what the assembled officials referred to in the minutes of the meeting as Die Endlösung der Judenfrage, the final solution to the Jewish question. The 15 men around the table were not soldiers or executioners. They were bureaucrats and party officials. 8 of the 15 held academic doctorates. They discussed logistics. They discussed the railway schedules that would be required to transport Jews from across occupied Europe to the killing centers. They discussed sequencing. Which countries first, which transportation routes, what volumes could be processed at the receiving end in what time frame. They discussed the definition of Jewishness in cases of mixed parentage. They discussed what to do with Jews who were in mixed marriages, with Jewish veterans decorated for service in the First World War, with Jews who had been sterilized. They spoke of all of this in the careful, technical language of administrators solving an operational problem. The Wannsee Protocol, the minutes of the meeting, survives in full. You can read it. It is perhaps the most chilling document in human history, not because it describes horror in lurid terms, but because it describes horror in bureaucratic terms. The murder of millions of human beings discussed in the cadences of a departmental planning meeting. To understand how this was possible, how 15 educated men could sit in a dining room and speak in those terms about those subjects and then have lunch, you need to understand the machine they were operating inside. The machine had multiple components, and they did not assemble overnight. They evolved across years of expanding persecution, refining their methods, becoming more efficient through practice and institutional competition in a system that consistently rewarded those who moved farthest fastest in the direction the ideology pointed. Begin at the top. Hitler's role in the Holocaust is a subject that has generated significant historical debate, not about his ultimate responsibility. That is not in question, but about the specific mechanics of how his decisions translated into operational policy. The evidence suggests that Hitler did not manage the Holocaust the way a chief executive manages a corporation. He did not review daily operational reports from the camps. He did not concern himself with railway scheduling. He did not write the orders for individual killing operations in his own hand. What he did was something more diffuse and in some ways more powerful. He communicated, sometimes explicitly, sometimes through ambiguous but unmistakable signals. A clear ideological direction, and the apparatus around him translated that direction into operational reality with a competitive zeal that often outran explicit authorization. The historian Ian Kershaw identified this dynamic as working toward the Führer, the process by which Nazi officials at every level of the hierarchy would anticipate what Hitler wanted and act on that anticipation, sometimes getting ahead of explicit orders in order to demonstrate ideological commitment and advance their own careers and institutional interests. This system did not require Hitler to micromanage because his subordinates had thoroughly internalized the ideology and were actively competing to implement it most effectively. But his authorization was real. It was given at key moments at the level at which he operated, the level of ideological sanction and political will. Heinrich Himmler, speaking to SS generals at Posen in October 1943 in a speech that was recorded on magnetic wire, said explicitly that the action they were carrying out, the extermination of the Jewish people, was something that has been carried out, and we talk about it quite openly among ourselves, yet we will never speak of it publicly. He said it had been ordered, and he said who had ordered it. The chain of authorization runs from Hitler to Himmler to Reinhard Heydrich, to the operational commanders of the camps and killing units. Heydrich. Reinhard Heydrich needs more than a passing mention because he was in certain respects the more operationally dangerous of the two men. Where Hitler provided the ideological fuel, Heydrich provided the organizational ignition, and he did so with an intelligence and capability that was qualitatively different from the blunt instruments of most of the Nazi leadership. He was tall, blonde, athletic, and musically gifted, a first-rate violinist who had once considered a musical career. He was cold in a way that went beyond ideological coldness into something that seemed to have no flaw. He was born in 1904 into a musical family and had a normal, middle-class German upbringing before joining the Navy, being dismissed from the Navy over an affair, and finding his way into the SS through Himmler in 1931. He rose with terrifying speed, from nothing to head of the SD, the SS intelligence service, in months. He understood systems, he understood information, he understood the organizational use of fear. He was, by his mid-30s, one of the 2 or 3 most powerful people in Nazi Germany. He organized Kristallnacht, He organized the Einsatzgruppen. He organized Wannsee. He was assassinated in Prague in May 1942 by Czech and Slovak paratroopers who had been trained in Britain and parachuted into occupied Bohemia specifically for the purpose. Heydrich was shot while riding in an open-top Mercedes, an inexplicable security failure for the head of the Reich's security apparatus, perhaps a product of the arrogance of a man accustomed to being feared. He died of his wounds 8 days later. Hitler ordered reprisals that included the execution of 1,300 Czech civilians and the complete destruction of the village of Lidis, whose male inhabitants were shot, whose women and children were sent to concentration camps, and whose houses were burned to the ground and the rubble bulldozed. But the machine Heydrich had built did not need him. It had achieved institutional momentum. The first major mechanism of industrialized killing deployed in the Holocaust was not gas chambers, it was bullets. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, Operation Barbarossa, the largest military operation in history, involving over 3 million German troops along a front stretching from the Arctic to the Black Sea. 4 specially organized units followed behind the advancing army. They were called Einsatzgruppen, mobile operational groups, each containing between 500 and 1,000 men, subdivided into Einsatzkommandos and Sonderkommandos. Their mission, as documented in subsequent orders and in the testimony of their own commanders at the Nuremberg trials, was to kill Jews, all Jews, in the territories the German army was conquering. The methodology was straightforward. An Einsatzkommando would enter a village or town. The local population would be informed that all Jews were required to assemble at a specified location, bringing their documents and valuables for relocation. The Jews would assemble, some of them knowing, some of them not knowing, all of them afraid. They would be marched to a location outside the town, typically a ravine or a forest clearing where a pit had been dug in advance, sometimes by the victims themselves, sometimes by local labor. They would be told to undress, to leave their valuables, to leave their clothes, and then they would be shot. At Babi Yar, a ravine on the outskirts of Kiev in Ukraine, Einsatzgruppe C killed 33,771 Jews in 2 days, September 29th and 30th, 1941. That number has been authenticated by the unit's own operational reports, filed with SS headquarters in the precise language of bureaucratic record-keeping. 33,771 people. In 48 hours, men, women, children, infants carried to the ravine by their parents, who had been told they were being resettled. Elderly people who could not walk independently, helped to the edge by the guards. 2 days. By the end of 1941, the 4 Einsatzgruppen had collectively killed approximately 500,000 people. By the end of the war, the total killed by mobile killing units across the Soviet Union would reach approximately 2 million. This was, remember, not the gas chambers. This was the earlier, less mechanized phase of the killing, carried out by men with rifles, unit by unit, village by village, across the vast spaces of the occupied Soviet Union. The Einsatzgruppen commanders were not obscure figures operating at the margins of the regime. They were senior SS and police officials. They wrote reports to Berlin. Those reports were circulated through the security apparatus. The scale of what they were doing was known to the entire Nazi leadership. Himmler visited a mass shooting at Minsk in August 1941. He watched. He reportedly felt faint. He told the assembled officers afterward that what they were doing was a historic necessity, that future generations would thank them, that the psychological burden they were bearing was proof of their devotion to Germany. He then returned to Berlin and ordered his technical staff to look for a more efficient method. More efficient. Not for the victims, for the perpetrators. The search for efficiency produced the gas vans, sealed trucks into which exhaust fumes were pumped while prisoners were loaded inside. Deployed first at the Chelmno killing center in December 1941, and then the permanent gas chambers constructed at the 6 dedicated extermination camps, built specifically for the purpose of killing human beings on an industrial scale. The 6 camps, Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno, and Majdanek, were all located in occupied Polish territory. This was not accidental. Poland had the largest Jewish population in Europe, approximately 3 million Jews before the war. It was also deep inside German-controlled territory, far from the eyes of neutral observers, far from the front lines of the Western campaign. The camps were built in a region where the population was Slavic, considered racially inferior, and therefore less likely to generate moral objections, and where the infrastructure of an occupied colonial administration could be deployed to organize the deportations. Treblinka killed approximately 900,000 people between July 1942 and October 1943. Belzec killed approximately 500,000 between March and December 1942. Sobibor killed approximately 250,000 between April 1942 and October 1943. Chelmno killed approximately 340,000 between December 1941 and March 1943, and then again briefly in 1944 and 1945. Majdanek killed approximately 60,000. Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest, the longest operating, the one that has become the central symbol of the Holocaust in collective memory, killed between 1.1 and 1.5 million people between 1942 and January 1945. The Zyklon B used at Auschwitz was manufactured by a company called Degisch, a subsidiary of the German chemical giant IG Farben. The company knew its product was being used to kill people. It continued manufacturing. It continued supplying. The company's executives made a business decision, and the business decision was to continue. IG Farben itself operated a synthetic rubber factory adjacent to Auschwitz-Birkenau, a facility called Buna Werke, built specifically to utilize the captive labor force of the camp. The company paid the SS a daily fee per laborer, 4 Reichsmarks per unskilled worker, 6 per skilled worker. IG Farben executives visited the camp. They saw the conditions. They made the business decision to continue. After the war, several IG Farben executives were tried at Nuremberg and convicted of using slave labor. They received sentences ranging from 18 months to 8 years. Most were released early. Several resumed careers in German industry. The Reichsbahn, the German National Railway, transported Jews to the extermination camps in sealed freight cars at standard commercial rates billed to the SS. The booking clerks who wrote the freight orders treated these as ordinary transport contracts. Children under 10 traveled at half the adult price. Children under 4 traveled free. This is documented in the billing records. The railway administrators were not primarily anti-Semites. They were bureaucrats and transportation professionals operating within a system where this was a valid category of freight, documented, scheduled, paid for, and delivered. They made the bureaucratic decision to process these orders the same way they processed orders for coal and timber and agricultural equipment. This is the architecture of the machine, not a monolith of evil directed from a single controlling intelligence, a system, a vast interlocking system of institutions, careers, professional norms, economic incentives, ideological training, and bureaucratic habit, in which the murder of millions was diffused across thousands of ordinary decisions made by thousands of ordinary people at ordinary desks, following ordinary procedures. The SS officer who signed the transport orders, the railway clerk who booked the cars, the factory manager who arranged the labor contracts, the physician who conducted the selections on the ramp, the guard who maintained order in the undressing room, the Sonderkommando prisoner who operated the crematorium under threat of death. Each of them was a link in a chain. Each chain was part of a system. The system produced a result that no single person in it could be said to have chosen alone. And this, as Hannah Arendt would observe 2 decades later, was precisely the point. Arendt attended the 1961 trial of Adolf Eichmann, SS Obersturmbannführer Adolf Eichmann, who had served as the head of the section of the Gestapo, responsible for organizing the deportation of Jews from across occupied Europe to the camps. He had been the man who arranged the trains, who coordinated with the foreign governments, who negotiated with the Hungarian authorities, who kept the deportation schedules running when other priorities threatened to interfere. Eichmann had fled to Argentina after the war using false papers and was living as Ricardo Clement in Buenos Aires when the Israeli Mossad located him in 1960 and abducted him in a dramatic operation that violated Argentine sovereignty and produced an international incident. He was brought to Israel, tried publicly, and convicted of crimes against humanity. He was executed by hanging in May 1962, the only person ever executed by the State of Israel. What Arendt found, attending his trial and writing about it afterward in her book Eichmann in Jerusalem, was not a monster in the conventional sense. What she found was something she described as the banality of evil. And that phrase has been argued about and misunderstood ever since, so it is worth being precise about what she meant. Eichmann was not a sadist. He was not a raving ideological fanatic of the striker variety. He was a bureaucrat, a middling, unimaginative, career-oriented bureaucrat who had found in the SS structure a ladder to climb and, in the final solution, an operational challenge to manage. He told Arendt, repeatedly, insistently, that he had never killed anyone personally, that he had simply organized transportation logistics, that he had been following orders, that he would have followed different orders if different orders had been given. He seemed genuinely confused by the suggestion that his moral responsibility extended to the destinations of the trains he scheduled. He had been a functionary. He had done his job. What happened at the end of the railway line was someone else's department. The horror Arendt was pointing at was not the absence of humanity, but the absence of thought. Eichmann had participated in the murders of millions not out of pathological hatred, but out of a refusal, or perhaps an inability, to step back from the immediate operational demands of his role and think seriously about what those demands meant. He had never, as Arendt put it, thought, and that failure to think, that substitution of role and procedure and the approval of authority for actual moral judgment, was not unique to Eichmann. It was the quality that made the machine run. Christopher Browning studied Reserve Police Battalion 101, a unit of middle-aged Hamburg policemen, not SS ideologues, not even particularly political men, who were deployed to occupied Poland beginning in 1942 and given assignment to mass shooting operations against Jewish communities. Browning found that when their commander offered, before the first operation, to excuse any man who felt unable to participate, a small minority stepped aside. The rest complied. The men who complied were not threatened with death for refusal. They were not imprisoned. The evidence Browning examined suggests that the practical consequences of stepping aside were minimal, but stepping aside meant being different from the group. It meant marking yourself as somehow squeamish, morally particular, not a team player. It meant standing out, and most people, in most circumstances, will endure enormous moral compromise to avoid standing out. Compliance became habit. Habit became routine. Routine became something that no longer required conscious decision-making, because the decision had been made somewhere back at the beginning, and what came afterward was just the daily reality of a job. Men who had shot 500 people wrote home to their wives asking that their children's socks be mended. Men who had participated in the killing of entire villages sat down to dinner afterward. Not because they felt no discomfort. Some of them clearly did feel discomfort, and some of them drank heavily, and some of them requested transfers. But because the institutional structure around them defined what they were doing as normal, necessary, and authorized. The system required their compliance. It got it. And at the center of the system, the point of origination for the ideology that made all the normalizations possible. The authority structure, whose approval was cited by every link in the chain as justification for the chain, was Hitler. There are historians who argue that the Holocaust was to some degree a product of institutional dynamics that outran Hitler's own intentions, that the competitive radicalism of the Nazi system produced outcomes that were the result of systemic forces rather than a single man's deliberate plan. This argument has genuine scholarly support for some aspects of the evolution of policy, particularly in the early years. The move from forced emigration to deportation to systematic murder was not a straight line, and the specific decisions at specific moments were made by multiple actors with multiple motivations. But at the end of his life, in his last political testament, dictated in the Berlin bunker on April the 29th, 1945, 48 hours before he shot himself, with the Red Army fighting 2 miles away in the streets of his capital, Hitler wrote these words. Above all, he charged the future leadership of Germany with the maintenance of the racial laws and the pitiless resistance against the world poisoner of all peoples, the Jewish people. 48 hours before his death. Everything he had built was collapsing around him. The city was burning. The Reich he had predicted would last 1,000 years was going to last approximately 12. And what he chose to communicate in his last hours was that the Jews must continue to be destroyed. That is not the statement of a man who was swept along by events. That is the statement of a man who knew, from beginning to end, exactly what he wanted. Berlin. April 30th, 1945. The city has been burning for days. The Soviet First Belarusian Front and First Ukrainian Front have been fighting through the city block by block since April 26th, and the sounds of artillery and tank fire are audible inside the Führer bunker, the reinforced concrete structure 30 meters beneath the Reich Chancellery Garden, where Hitler has been living since January. The walls of the bunker are damp with condensation. The ventilation system is inadequate. The mood among the remaining staff cycles between denial, false hope, and the specific terror of people who understand what is coming. Above them, the Reich is gone in any meaningful sense. German armies in the West are surrendering. German armies in Italy have already surrendered. The men left defending Berlin are old men in the Volkssturm and teenage boys from the Hitler Youth, fighting with whatever weapons they can find against the most powerful military force in Europe. 2 miles from the bunker, Soviet soldiers are inside the Reichstag. In the afternoon, Hitler and Eva Braun, the woman he married the previous day in a brief ceremony in the bunker's conference room, retired to his personal study. Eva Braun took cyanide. Hitler put a Walter PPK pistol to his right temple and pulled the trigger. Their bodies were carried up the stairs into the garden and placed in a shallow depression in the bomb-cratered earth. Gasoline was poured over them and set alight. The fire burned incompletely. There was not enough gasoline to fully incinerate both bodies, and Soviet soldiers found the charred remains 2 days later and identified them through dental records. The man who had set Europe on fire was ash in a shell crater. The war in Europe ended 8 days later. What he left behind is a number that still defeats language. 6 million Jews murdered. This is the most documented, most studied, most precisely calculated element of the Holocaust's death toll, and it represents approximately 2/3 of the Jewish population of Europe. The communities that had lived across the continent for hundreds and in some cases thousands of years. Communities with their own languages, Yiddish in the east, Ladino in the southeast, the 1,000 local dialects and accents of the Jewish communities of Poland and Hungary and Germany and France and Greece. Communities with their own press, their own theaters, their own arguments about politics and religion and the future. Schools, synagogues, cemeteries, markets, kitchen traditionals, jokes, songs, prayers. Gone. Not assimilated, not dispersed. Systematically hunted and killed. But the Jewish dead were not the only dead. The Nazis killed approximately 5.7 million non-Jewish Soviet civilians. They killed approximately 3 million non-Jewish Polish civilians, a figure that includes approximately 90% of Poland's pre-war Jewish population, but also a vast number of ethnic Poles, Catholic clergy, intellectuals, and people designated by the regime as racially or politically undesirable. They killed approximately 250,000 to 500,000 Roma. The precise number is difficult to establish because Roma populations were poorly documented in most countries before the war, a fact that is itself a measure of the historic marginalization of these communities. They killed between 200,000 and 250,000 people with physical and mental disabilities in the program called Action T4, which began in 1939 and was a systematic state-organized euthanasia program that gassed disabled Germans with CO2 in specially constructed chambers. The same technology, the same bureaucratic methodology, and in several cases, the same personnel who would later operate the extermination camps. The T4 program was, in a precise technical sense, a prototype. The doctors who ran it, the administrators who managed the paperwork, the drivers who transported patients in sealed vans became the operational backbone of the later killing centers. The machinery of genocide was rehearsed on German disabled citizens before being deployed against European Jews. They killed between 2.7 and 3.3 million Soviet prisoners of war, soldiers who were entitled, under international law, to humane treatment as prisoners and who were instead starved, shot, worked to death, or simply locked in open enclosures without food, water, or shelter in the Polish winter. Of the 5.7 million Soviet soldiers captured by Germany, approximately 3.3 million were dead by 1945. This is a death rate of roughly 57%. By comparison, British and American prisoners in German camps died at a rate of approximately 4%. The difference was deliberate policy. They killed homosexual men. Estimated 70,000 to 100,000 who were required to wear the pink triangle in the camps. They killed Jehovah's Witnesses who refused to renounce their faith. They killed trade union leaders, political prisoners, Catholic priests who spoke against the regime from the pulpit. The total civilian and non-combat prisoner death toll attributable to the direct policies of the Nazi regime is estimated at between 11 and 17 million people, depending on how the categories are defined and how the evidence is weighted. This does not include the tens of millions of military and civilian deaths caused by the wars of conquest that the regime launched. These are not numbers, they are people. Janusz Korczak was a Polish educator, pediatric physician, and author of children's books who ran the Dom Sierot orphanage in the Warsaw Ghetto. He was internationally known. His children's radio programs had made him a familiar voice across Polish-speaking Europe. When the Nazis ordered the liquidation of the ghetto in August 1942 and the deportation of the children to Treblinka, Korczak was offered sanctuary by Polish friends outside the ghetto walls. He refused to leave his 192 orphaned children. On August 5, 1942, Janusz Korczak walked with his children to the Umschlagplatz, the deportation square, at the head of a column. He was 53 years old. He held the hand of a child on each side. He and all 192 children were loaded onto the trains to Treblinka, where they were killed. He was 64 years old when he was murdered. No, he was not 64. He was whatever age he was when he looked at those 192 children and decided that he would not save himself while they could not save themselves. That decision is what he was. The rest is just numbers. Irina Sendler was a Polish Catholic social worker who, beginning in 1942, organized a clandestine network that smuggled approximately 2,500 Jewish children out of the Warsaw Ghetto. They went through sewer pipes, in potato sacks, in toolboxes, under the floors of ambulances. She kept the children's real names and the names and addresses of their parents written on cigarette papers and buried in jars in a friend's garden with the intention of eventually reuniting families. She was arrested by the Gestapo in October 1943, tortured over a period of 3 months, had both her legs and both her feet broken. She did not reveal the locations of the children. She was sentenced to death. Members of her underground organization bribed a guard the night before her execution. She escaped. She retrieved the jars after the war. Most of the parents whose names were on those cigarette papers had been killed. But she tried. Primo Levi was a 24-year-old chemistry student from Turin when he was arrested as a member of the Italian anti-fascist resistance in 1943 and deported to Auschwitz. He survived because his training as a chemist made him useful to the camp's industrial operations. He wrote about the experience for the rest of his life, in prose of such clarity and moral precision that his work has become one of the primary documents through which the world understands what Auschwitz was. He wrote, "If there is one thing certain about Auschwitz, it is this: whoever has survived it has not survived intact." He died in 1987, falling down the stairwell of his Turin apartment building. The authorities ruled it a suicide, though it was never conclusively established. He was 67 years old. He had survived Auschwitz and 42 years of life afterward. The Nuremberg trials began in November 1945. 22 senior Nazi leaders were tried before an international military tribunal composed of judges from the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. The indictments included crimes against peace, the planning and waging of aggressive war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The last category was arguably the most significant legally, because it asserted that crimes committed by a government against civilian populations, even its own, were subject to international legal accountability. 12 defendants were sentenced to death. Among them, Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, and Hitler's designated successor, Joachim von Ribbentrop, foreign minister, Hans Frank, Governor-General of occupied Poland, Wilhelm Frick, Minister of the Interior, Julius Streicher, publisher of Der Stürmer, the virulently anti-Semitic Nazi newspaper. Goering escaped execution by ingesting a cyanide capsule smuggled into his cell. The capsule's provenance was never definitively established. The others were hanged on October 16, 1946. The trials were imperfect. The Soviet Union, which sat as a prosecuting power and which had its own crimes against civilian populations of comparable scale, the Ukrainian famine, the Katyn massacre, the mass deportations of entire ethnic groups, was not subjected to the same standards it applied to the defendants. Some participants received sentences that seemed inadequate given what they had done. The Cold War was already beginning to reshape the political pressures around the proceedings, but the Nuremberg trials also established something genuinely new in the architecture of international law. They established that crimes against humanity are crimes for which individuals can be held accountable regardless of state authorization. They rejected the defense of following orders. They asserted the existence of a moral law above the laws of states, a law that human beings are responsible for following even when their government tells them otherwise. This was a revolutionary principle. It was born directly from the attempt to hold accountable the men who had built and run the machine at Wannsee and Auschwitz and Babi Yar. Germany's relationship with its own history is one of the more remarkable and complicated stories of the post-war world. West Germany, under Allied occupation and then under the chancellorship of Konrad Adenauer, undertook a process called Vergangenheitsbewältigung, coming to terms with the past. It is an imperfect German compound word for an imperfect process. The imperfections were real and significant. Many former Nazis were rehabilitated into the West German government, judiciary, military, and business world in the early post-war years, protected by the political imperatives of the Cold War and by the simple fact that Germany's administrative institutions were full of people who had served the regime and could not be replaced overnight. The full scale of ordinary German participation and complicity was not honestly confronted for decades. Perhaps not until the 1990s, when a new generation of historians and the publication of work like Christopher Browning's Ordinary Men and Daniel Goldhagen's more controversial Hitler's Willing Executioners forced a more searching public reckoning. But Germany also did things that few nations that have committed comparable atrocities have done. It built the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, an undulating field of 2,711 concrete slabs of varying heights, covering an area the size of 2 city blocks in the heart of the capital, a few hundred meters from where the Führer bunker stood. The memorial, designed by the architect Peter Eisenman, is deliberately disorienting. As you move between the slabs and they rise above your head, the pathways between them narrowing, the ground undulating so that you lose your footing slightly, you experience a mild version of something that should not be mild. The sense of being enclosed, of losing your bearings, of the familiar world above and around you receding. It is one of the few memorials in the world that attempts to produce an emotional state rather than simply commemorate a fact. Germany criminalized Holocaust denial. It criminalized the display of Nazi symbols. It built Yad Vashem, Israel's Holocaust Memorial Institution, with German funding. It paid reparations to survivors and to the State of Israel. It incorporated the history, not selectively but comprehensively, into mandatory school curricula, so that every German child now studies the Holocaust in a way that includes both what happened and how ordinary Germans participated in making it happen. These gestures are not sufficient. Nothing is sufficient. but they represent something historically unusual, a sustained, institutionalized national commitment to reckoning with an atrocity rather than burying it. The Holocaust is the most documented event in modern history. The Nazis, with characteristic German thoroughness, kept records, orders, reports, billing documents, railway schedules, transport manifests, operational tallies. When the war ended, the records were captured before they could be fully destroyed, and they form an archive of extraordinary completeness. Add to this the thousands of survivor testimonies, the projects led by Yad Vashem, by the USC Shoah Foundation, by historians across the world who spent decades recording the voices of survivors before time took them. And the historical literature of the Holocaust is richer and more precise than the record of almost any other event in human history. We know a great deal about what happened. We know who did it. We know how the decisions were made and by whom. The question that resists final answer is, how? How did this happen in a country with this level of civilization, this level of education, this density of cultural and intellectual accomplishment? Germany had more Nobel laureates per capita than almost any other country. It had produced Kant and Hegel, Goethe and Schiller, Bach and Beethoven and Brahms. Its universities were the model that American and British universities had spent the 19th century trying to emulate. The country that built the gas chambers was the same country that had given the world the philosophy of universal human dignity and the music that seems most nearly to speak to the transcendent. And yet, the Holocaust was made possible by the accumulated weight of centuries of European anti-Semitism. The pogroms, the forced conversions, the legal discriminations, the theological hatred that had been depositing its sediment in European culture since the Middle Ages. It was made possible by the specific historical catastrophes of post-World War I Germany. It was made possible by the failure of democratic institutions, the complicity of economic elites, the indifference of foreign governments who prioritized appeasement over confrontation until the machinery of murder was already operational. It was made possible by the willingness of ordinary people, doctors and lawyers and railway clerks and middle-aged policemen and factory managers, to accommodate themselves to the demands of an authoritarian system that told them a coherent story about why what they were doing was necessary. And it was driven forward, given coherence and direction and purpose, by one man's obsession. Hitler did not create European anti-Semitism. He weaponized it. He did not build the German state. He captured it. He did not invent bureaucratic efficiency or industrial technology. He applied them to a purpose that gave his ideology its fullest possible expression. But without him, without his specific, uncompromising, decades-long commitment to the elimination of the Jewish people from Europe, the Holocaust, as a total, systematic, industrial project of extermination, would not have happened. It is possible to imagine a Nazi Germany without Auschwitz. It is not possible to imagine Auschwitz without Hitler. Viktor Frankl was an Austrian psychiatrist who was deported to Auschwitz in 1944 and survived. He lost his wife, his mother, and his brother in the camps. He wrote afterward, in Man's Search for Meaning, that everything can be taken from a person except one thing, the last of the human freedoms, the ability to choose one's own response to any given set of circumstances. Even in the camps, he observed, there were people who gave their last bread to others, who comforted strangers, who maintained human dignity when the machinery around them was designed to strip it away entirely. Frankl's observation does not redeem the Holocaust. Nothing redeems it. But it points to something important about the human capacity for choice, a capacity that worked in both directions. The perpetrators chose, the bystanders chose, the rescuers chose. The survivors, in the space that was left to them, chose how to live inside the dying. Hitler made his choices. His architects made theirs. The men at Wannsee made theirs. The railway clerks and the camp guards and the factory managers and the neighbors who swept the broken glass off the sidewalk in the morning. They made theirs. And the people who hid children in potato sacks and sewed names on cigarette papers and walked with orphan children to train stations, they made theirs. The world those choices produced is the world we still inhabit. The international legal architecture designed to prevent and punish genocide grew from Nuremberg. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948, was written with the Holocaust explicitly in mind. It was an attempt to articulate, at the level of international law, the moral principles whose systematic violation the Holocaust had represented. The State of Israel was created in the political space made possible by the Holocaust's revelation of what Jewish statelessness meant in a world of hostile nation-states. The Holocaust is not finished with us. It continues to operate on the present, not as a remembered event, but as an unresolved challenge. The challenge is this: a modern, educated, scientifically sophisticated nation-state under the leadership of one man with a clear ideology and a competent organizational apparatus, constructed a system that killed 11 to 17 million people in approximately 6 years, with the participation or the acquiescence of the vast majority of its citizens. The conditions that produced this were not unique to Germany in 1933. Economic catastrophe, wounded national pride, a charismatic demagogue offering simple explanations and identifiable enemies, the capture of democratic institutions by an ideological movement, the willingness of business and intellectual elites to accommodate themselves to power. None of these are historically specific. All of them recur. All of them have recurred. The maintenance of civilization against the possibility of its reversal is not automatic. It is not guaranteed by prosperity or education or cultural sophistication. It requires active maintenance. It requires the refusal of the bystander position. It requires institutions strong enough to resist the capture by ideological movements. It requires citizens willing to be uncomfortable, to stand out, to refuse the path of least resistance when the path of least resistance leads somewhere they know they should not go. The men of Reserve Police Battalion 101 could have stepped aside. Most of them did not. The railway clerks could have refused to sign the transport orders. Most of them did not. The IG Farben executives could have declined the labor contracts. They did not. And somewhere upstream from all of them, the conservative politicians around Hindenburg could have refused to hand power to a man who had told them exactly what he intended to do with it. They did not. The question the Holocaust poses to every subsequent generation is not primarily a historical question. It is a personal one. What do you do when you are inside the chain? What do you do when the institutional structure around you normalizes what you suspect is wrong? What do you do when stepping aside costs you something real? Career, reputation, the approval of your peers, your physical safety. Most people, most of the time, accommodate. The Holocaust is a record of what accommodation produces when the direction it is pointed in is systematic mass murder. On that ramp at Birkenau, in May 1944, a 16-year-old girl named Hedy Bohm was separated from her mother at the selection. Her mother went left. Hedy went right. She did not know, at that moment, what left meant. She found out afterward. Hedy survived. She emigrated to Canada after the war. She became a Holocaust educator and spent decades speaking to students and community groups, telling her story, bearing witness to what had happened and why it must be remembered. She was still speaking publicly in her 90s. She remembers the smell. She remembers the lights. She remembers her mother's face at the moment of separation. The specific, irreplaceable face of a specific human being who was about to be murdered by the most advanced bureaucratic state in human history. She remembers so that we do not forget. We should not forget. Because the architecture of atrocity, the ideology, the bureaucracy, the complicity, the bystander silence, the manipulation of democratic institutions, the promise of restored greatness, the carefully maintained fiction that the people in the cattle cars are not quite people. None of it has been dismantled. It has only been interrupted. And the interruption requires maintenance. It requires you. It requires the refusal to look away. It requires the decision, made again every time it needs to be made, to step aside when the line you are standing in leads somewhere you know it should not. That is the cost of civilization. It is not a one-time payment. It is paid every day.